Introduction to Trans Healthcare. My job is to make sure that we're all using common language. So we're going to talk about some definitions and constructs. And a lot of you have good experience in the field, but some of you are rather new. And so we want to make sure we're all speaking some common language and have some common ideas, particularly looking also at the WPATH competency framework for understanding what we feel are really important domains for care that is compassionate and informed for the trans and gender diverse communities. So we'll be talking a little bit about all those domain areas. So we will own this as a North American historical cultural narrative, but it is common to many cultures. But I don't want to assume that it's true for all cultures. So what I want to describe here is that basically this is what I call a ladder of assumptions. And that is that at birth, we have assumed that we can determine there are people who are given a male gender marker. They are assigned a male gender marker. That's language we use, or designated male at birth. And that is a thing that is done to all of us without our consent at birth. And then it is assumed that people who have been assigned that male gender marker are going to grow into individuals who have the gender identity of being a man. Gender identity is a relatively recent term. It wasn't really even around a few decades ago because the assumptions were so entrenched that somebody who was assigned a male gender marker was going to be growing up and being a man, identifying as a man. And then along with that, there was an assumption that person would display their gender, they'd express themselves in ways that were considered masculine. And that part of that assumption was also that those individuals would be attracted to women. So there's this whole last ladder of assumptions. Similarly, there are assumptions made for people assigned female at birth. This is typically based on external genitalia if it was done at birth. And then they were assumed to grow into being identifying as women and then having feminine gender expression and being attracted to men. So we're going to deconstruct this ladder of assumptions a bit today, among other things. So first we need to really look at the assignment of gender markers. Now sex we need to distinguish from gender identity. And sex is typically really a biological term that has been historically based on external genitalia, and sex markers were assigned at birth for a long time. Nowadays, often doing genetic testing in utero, that may even happen before somebody is born based on the chromosomal profile. Additionally, we think about reproductive structures that are present, as well as hormones and receptors that are present, and secondary sex characteristics, and then the sex dimorphic brain structures. All of things are very biological. So we think about sex in the field as being much more of a biological thing that we need to recognize. But in understanding gender identity, it was actually really helpful for me to do some research in understanding that actually biology occurs beyond the binary as well. So what do I mean by that? So there are individuals who are intersex or have the clinical term you would see is disorders of sex development. In the field, we typically say differences of sex development to indicate that variation is biologically normal. If you look around the room, we have different hair colors, different skin colors, different hair textures, heights, widths, etc. So variation is biologically normal. And so we talk about differences of sex development. And a few examples of differences of sex development, and in the area here, we're talking often these lead to differences in reproductive structures or in genitalia that are observed. And so those are the intersex conditions. And there are hormonal variations that can lead to, for example, masculine feminization of folks with XX chromosomes, like folks who have complete or partial androgen insensitivity syndrome. We can also see masculinization in folks with congenital adrenal hyperplasia who have two X chromosomes. So we're already seeing there can be variations outside of those expected ladder of assumptions. Then there are also some chromosomal variations like Klinefelters, where we can have multiple X's in a Y chromosome, or Turners, where there's an X and an O, a blank on the other chromosome. So already we see that there are differences in sex development, so that binary foundational piece of the ladder doesn't really hold true. And then additionally, we need to think about identity. Again, that wasn't a term that we had until more recently. That's our internal sense of our gendered selves. All of us have a gender identity, and there are going to be a range of gender identities I'm going to talk about, but we all have them. Transgender refers to folks whose gender identity doesn't fit in, or their gender expression doesn't fit in or conform to the cultural and social expectations for the sex that they were designated at birth. And this is an umbrella term because it's going to cover a lot of different folks who do not identify necessarily with the sex they were designated at birth. Cisgender is the majority of the population. These are folks who feel their gender identity aligns and their expression aligns with the cultural and social expectations for the sex they were assigned at birth. And then non-transgender, I like this, it's an equalizing term because not everybody who is not cisgender identifies as transgender. So it's an alternative also for agender, non-binary, and others who don't identify as transgender, as well as some folks who are cisgender might be called non-transgender. The SOC8 reminds us that it's good clinical practice always to use the terminology that people use for themselves, okay? So that's really where we want to listen to our patients and our clients. So I'm going to take a minute and go on a little detour here because we all come here with different stories or routes. When I was in graduate school in the 1980s, there was very little bit of work on transgender issues, and the term back then was much more transsexual. There wasn't a lot of discussion about trans healthcare back in the 1980s. I graduated with my doctorate in 1989. So I'll do some math for you. I was born in 1962, and so I'm 60, and just happened this year. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Live to tell the tale. So, and, you know, I never thought that I would be in this field because, like I said, it wasn't a field when I was going through graduate school. It wasn't talked about that much when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s. However, when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, I was always interested in America, where I'm from, the United States of America, there was the women's liberation movement was going on. And I found it very intriguing because it was criticizing the rules and limitations and the expectations for women and girls. And so it was also then implicitly criticizing the rules and limitations for men or boys. I'm intentionally speaking in a binary fashion because that was all I really knew about then. I think that I was so interested in the women's liberation movement because I was assigned a female gender marker at birth. I was raised as a girl in the United States. And I was fortunate that my parents, despite being very conservative and traditional in their own way, my father being of Latino background and in the military as his first career, and my mother being an old-fashioned Southern woman in the US of A, they thought it was adorable that I was a tomboy. And so that was all right when I was a young kid. And so I was able to play with the boys and ride bikes and play American football, and didn't have as much international football back then. And I was also able to, play with Army men, even though my dad was in the Navy. And I was able to, just hang out with the guys and pitch pennies and just play with Hot Wheels and those little cars. And I did a lot of things with the boys. And that was fine. And then I hit middle school. And I started feeling the pressure from my peers more, not as much my parents at that point or family, but from my peers, that I should start girling up. So just imagine that. I started to try to do things to fit in, and I was like, I guess this is what I'm supposed to do. And then go into high school. And I want you to envision this person having to go to the girls' locker room. And some straight guys might think that's great, but it felt horrible for me. I feel like I'm in the wrong place. I feel embarrassed to undress or be seen by these people or to see them like I'm not supposed to be here, but I don't know what to say and how to describe it, because this was long ago in the dark ages before there was this amazing thing called Google. And so I couldn't Google what was going on, and so I thought, I guess just teenagers feel awkward. That's what everybody says, and I guess that's what I'm feeling is like this teenage angst. And so fortunately, I was interested in school, so I focused a lot of my studies, and my parents were very supportive of that and supported me as I went through college, and I kept trying to conform to social expectations and grew my hair long. It was down to the middle of my back by the time I was, finishing college. And it was just uncomfortable. I was uncomfortable, but I thought, I guess everybody's adolescent and college and figuring life out, and this is just how it's supposed to be. And because I was good at school, I went to graduate school, earned my PhD in psychology, and there was this other thing that started happening in high school, by the way, that I realized, oh yeah, I'm attracted to girls. And at that point, I thought, I guess I'm homosexual or lesbian. And kind of cracks me up to say that with this face now, but it was the best sense I could make of my experience. But I was, pretty closeted because it was not a very welcoming time in the 1980s. But after I finished graduate school, I came out and really connected with the lesbian and gay community and did a lot of work and became established in the Atlanta, Georgia area as a psychologist specializing in that area. And I founded the LGB division within the Georgia Psychological Association, or GPA, and became known in the field in the area for that, and did some national level work for lesbian and gay issues. And I was very fortunate that I was able to build a career and establish a practice and be known among colleagues. And then, there was one area, though, that was challenging because, remember I told you my parents were conservative? So when I did the whole coming out as lesbian thing, yeah, that wasn't so great. And so there was a lot of butting heads, a lot of challenges there with my parents and my siblings coming to grips, but especially my parents coming to grips with my being a lesbian. I mean, it took a long time for us to reach some peace around those issues. And I was fortunate, though, that by the time I was in my 40s, my practice was established, my reputation in the area I was practicing was established, and I had a partnership of about 10 years as I was in my mid-40s. And I was feeling, though, like something still feels wrong. Like my life is so good, but something is still not right for me. And so then there started to become more news about transgender issues. You all may remember Chaz Bono transitioned, Caitlyn Jenner, some other folks. It got big headlines, and I started going, oh, I think there's something here that I need to pay attention to. And then I was like, oh, I think there's something here I have to pay attention to. And I promise you, I did not want to be transgender. I did not want to go through another coming out process. Spoiler alert, I did. And I'm going to tell you briefly about that because haven't done this in public for a minute, so it's a little emotional. It's harder than you can imagine. And having gone through a coming out as a gay person eons ago, for me, this felt harder because there's not a person in my life that I could not tell if I wanted to keep my life intact where I was. And I didn't want to leave a community that I'd lived in and worked in for 20 years and had colleagues and friends. And so, transitioning female to male, becoming more me, was absolutely exhausting because I had to not only talk to my medical care providers, but I had to talk to anybody I wanted to keep my long-term relationship with, my accountant, the landlord for my office building, pharmacist, dentist, neighbors, so they wouldn't wonder what's happening, who's this walking the dog now? What's that? There's nobody that doesn't get told. And so then I had to come out to all my colleagues and all my clients. And anxiety and depression are common words that you'll hear people say or use, but they don't do justice to the experience. There is this feeling of, once I realized who I was, I cannot stay not me anymore. And I cannot escape. I don't say that I was trapped in the wrong body, but I need my body fixed and aligned as soon as possible. And yet I had to navigate all these social challenges because I wanted to handle my clinical work ethically and responsibly in coming out and developing a plan to come out to my patients as well as with my colleagues. But I was terrified they would all think I was a freak. I was afraid they would think I had deceived them or lied to them. And I was like, no, I'm just a slow learner. And it took me a while to get this. And so I had to actually engage in a lot of meditation and prayer and some of my own counseling because of the level of anxiety and distress that I felt. Not everybody needs to, in different circumstances, but for me it was really helpful. And eventually I did all this coming out to so many people. It's exhausting. It is exhausting. And yet I was so relieved because everywhere I went, I was amazed with the amount of love and support I was met with. And my colleagues, I just want to say, after I had transitioned, like they threw me a debutante party. Really sweet. And then I was asked to chair the annual conference for GPA back in 2012. And I took on that because I was fortunate to have a vision for that the moment I was asked. And I also worked really, really hard because I was not going to be the first transgender person to chair this and not have it go well. And so But that is a pressure that anybody who's the first trans to do something feels. So fortunately, I had a wonderful committee and staff, and it was a sellout experience, and it went really well. And so then they rewarded that behavior by asking me to run for president of GPA. And actually, I declined because I was, at this point, I realized what it was. I was overwhelmed. I was still growing into this person. At that point, I'd only been transitioned medically for 2 years. And so I was still figuring out, who is this? There's a lot of growing into this. It's like, how do I be a man? If I'm a binary guy, like, and do I buy all the binary? Like, who? It's a lot to figure out. So for me, it took a minute. But then I was fortunate they asked me again 4 years later. And in 2016, when they nominated me to run for GPA president, I said, all right. And I was elected and served as the president of the Georgia Psychological Association from 2017 to 2018. And I'm emotional because I'm so grateful that my colleagues entrusted me with my professional organization, and that they saw that I had skills, talents, willingness to work that had nothing to do with my being trans. They didn't choose me because I was trans, and they did not choose me because I was trans. And I had amazing growth experiences that actually set me up to be able to do the work I'm doing in WPATH now. I got to represent mental health needs for the state of Georgia at our state capitol and at the United States Capitol with our legislators. I got to run board meetings. I even got to make them fun, which I got to meet so many people and learn that there were things I could do that I didn't know I could do. And so I'm so grateful that my colleagues trusted me. But here's a really interesting thing that I tell parents, and when I talk at schools about this, I had wondered pre-transition in my former incarnation, as I call it, whether I'd ever want to be GPA president. And I was like, meh. And what I realize now is that I did not feel at ease. I was always still battling something. There was some energy tied up in me that my transition freed up. It was like, oh, I was trying to live a size 8 life, and I needed a size 10 pair of shoes, thank you very much. And I felt like, oh, this is how everybody else is feeling? This is amazing. This is so much easier. And I'm lucky, blessed to have been able to access that health care and to bring this into the world, because I think I bring a much better me into the world now. And then talking about my family is the harder part. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So remember the whole conservative fighting with family? I was like, okay, if my coming out as a lesbian led to that much conflict, they're going to disown me. And I was terrified. And I actually did a lot of advanced grief, anticipating that. And I sent letters to my family because I thought, this is the way I can take care of me and them. And as a good psychologist, I went through thinking about everything I could, and I wrote a letter as lovingly as I could to explain to them what I was experiencing. And I actually then wrote out, after the emotional piece, I gave them some FAQs about what about your health, what about your practice, etc. I included videos of people who'd transitioned. So the more work I did for them, the easier. And I also thought with a letter, they can have a response, and if it's not a great response, they can process it for a minute and then talk to me when they're ready to. And I'll never forget, I remember where I was getting the call from my mom. So I'm in my mid-40s, and my mom and dad were in their 70s. And my mom said, your dad had to go to the barbershop quartet rehearsal. But he said to say, hello, son. And in me at 60, it still has that effect on me. Think about the young people we see, young adults and adults, how important family support is for them to have as they embark on their gender questioning and their gender journeys. And to this day, I'm grateful that even when my parents could no longer remember our names, before they passed away, they both passed away in 2017, they'd say, hey son, it's so good to see you. And I know my story is not everybody's story, but I have no regrets. And I am so grateful to be here now. And the only thing I sometimes regret is I wish I could have figured it out sooner. But then I also feel like whatever brought me to this trajectory to be able to be here at this moment in transgender healthcare, it's a good thing. So I'm really happy to be here talking with y'all today, and I thank you for being here. Okay, so I have to get back to the other stuff now. So I mentioned that transgender is an umbrella term. So we also use the term gender diverse because there's a lot of different ways of not being cisgender. And gender nonconforming is a term we used to use a lot. You still see that some. And sometimes now we use that around gender expression. We also see sometimes the term gender variant, not as much. We see two-spirit. A lot of indigenous peoples use the two-spirit. Non-binary or gender non-binary and gender queer, gender fluid. I don't know if y'all are familiar with these terms. Gender queer is often kind of a socio-political rebellion. I knew somebody who looked like me, trans guy, who changed his gender marker but kept his typically female name. So I'd be talking to Jane, and even though I do this work, it's easy for my mind, especially being 60, to slip into the old binary that I grew up with. And talking to Jane, who looks like me, it was always like, oh yeah, that's good. That's a good reminder, really powerful. Gender fluid. I've had folks who, within the same day or the same week, may shift from feeling masculine, feminine, both, neither. And so that's a thing. Like, I have developed a part of my brain that's very fluid around, with some of my folks, asking them each week, what name are you going by? What pronouns are we using today? So it keeps us flexible to be doing this work. There's so much evolution and so much exciting work developing. Transmasculine or transfeminine for folks who identify kind of one realm or the other. I won't say side of the spectrum because we're thinking of gender as a much more complicated universe. As I've heard one person say, where we're all stars. Agender, some folks don't identify, gender is just not a thing. They're like, bleh. They don't do it. I had somebody who said their gender identity was geek. So open-minded. I've worked with quite a few people who live part-time for a long period of time because of a job, because they're letting their kids grow up, because of finances, waiting to retire, a number of reasons. And then there are also folks who may identify as a more neutral, or like male to eunuch or female to neutois, and folks who may or may not have medical or surgical or social interventions to help with their gender identity and expression. So we have to be open to each individual's needs. So we've talked about identity. Now let's talk about role. So these are the activities usually ascribed to a particular gender. And I intentionally chose this binary slide because this is how so much of the world still functions. Here at WPATH, we intentionally put up different signs on the bathrooms, but most of the places we go in the world, we don't have these signs. I have a weird hobby my fiance tolerates where I take bathroom signs, pictures wherever we go traveling. So, but you know, we have so many things that are defined male or female in the binary fashion that we're expected to do, those things that are expected of us. And these are often enforced in terms of the way our gender is expressed, the way we groom. I'm wearing a suit. I'm sending all sorts of he, him, male signals to you. But our voice, mannerisms, all these things can give clues. Even some of our hobbies or professions. You know, I like partner dancing. That's where I met my fiance. And I am a lead when we're dancing, which is typically a male role. My partner is a female. And, you know, there are all sorts of things we do where there are cultural expectations. I really like being in places, like sometimes being in queer spaces where men are dancing together or a woman's leading. But in the mainstream world, we run into all these expectations that are enforced by schools, by TVs, books, movies. Yay, we're getting new books and movies and TV programs that aren't just cisgender and heteronormative, but many of us have encountered these things, and it is what is still out there for the most part, but we're expanding the conversation. And these are also, yeah, this is how we rock our gender, right? So they're very culture-specific, too. So wearing a skirt may not be normative in North America, but it may be in some island nations, for example. All right, so sexuality. We also want, this is that last ladder, if you remember that last rung of the ladder. Last rung, sexual attraction. Briefly, attraction and arousal patterns often refer to the people we're attracted to. Now, this is a question. If you work with young people, like I see a lot of young people, a lot of adolescents, many parents come in and ask me, can't they just be gay? And it also cracks me up because when I first started my practice in the 90s, that never would have been a thing. And so now they're very happy to have that. Like, can't they just be gay? So I explained to the parents, I'm like, look, your kid can be cisgender and be gay, lesbian, straight, hetero, bi, pan, poly, ace, scolio. But guess what? Your kid can also be trans and be all those things. So, just to clarify, there are trans guys who look like me and they're attracted to men. So they are now gay men. There are women who are trans who are attracted to women. They are now lesbians. Can be an issue with their wives sometimes not being up for that. Take advanced mental health, where we may talk about that more later. So, to be clear, I was a lesbian. I was attracted to women before. Now I'm a straight white guy, which I never saw coming. I promise. So, So I include this middle category because there are some folks who are gender diverse, non-binary. They may or may not relate to the terms gay, lesbian, or straight. They may or may not, again, because those terms are defined in relation to one's own identity and the person you're attracted to. So that's why I have those question marks there. Some people may say they're more androphilic or gynophilic, or there are other terms, gynoromantic, androromantic. So you can still, though, be bisexual, pan, poly, because those are not as dependent on the identity of the person. All right, so when we're thinking about sexuality, we also need to recognize it doesn't always line up with people's actual behavior. I remember eons ago reading a book called Lesbian Nuns. I guess they're supposed to be celibate, but they still identified as lesbian. And folks, may not be engaging in behavior because they're married to one person and they've not yet come out till the kids grow up or something. They've not let other people know who they identify as being attracted to. Some people have sex with men, for example, in particular, men who have sex with men. They don't always identify as gay, and so that is a really important area of research, for example, in HIV and monkeypox. So people don't always identify with the community. And then some folks identify as asexual or aromantic and may not experience attractions or romantic interest. And we can break that down further, but you get the idea that not everybody's sexuality is straight, and we need to understand sexuality is independent of gender identity. So, ladder of assumptions, we have now totally deconstructed it, right? And we see that all kinds of possible variations exist. So that's what we want to embrace, and that's what we're often helping parents and families embrace also. So our big affirmation domains for trans folks and gender diverse people, we want to pay attention to social affirmation, particularly using names, pronouns, and supporting their presentation. There's psychological affirmation, and these are partly from the Lancet series, our special issue that Gail mentioned earlier. Being able to be authentic, so freeing and empowering. We want access to competent mental health care, and we want people to be able to be clear about who their sense of themselves is. We want them to have access to medical care with hormones safely prescribed and with reproductive options being discussed in advance by medical and mental health professionals. We want competent trans and primary care, so because trans folks don't just need medical care around trans stuff. I've had skin cancer. I've had to go to a doctor for skin cancer. So we have to have care for all the rest of us too. We want gender-affirming surgeries and procedures available. And we have guidelines now for care, and we also have voice and communication therapies that are offered. There are surgeries and procedures, and Christy Block's going to talk about that later today. We also want to have legal affirmation where people have the right to determine their gender marker, their name. There are places in the world where you cannot do that, or you cannot do that without surgical or medical intervention, which is not what WPATH supports. We support people being able to identify as they are without interventions needed. So we want to think about these things when we're helping people with their transition or gender journeys, whatever they are. So we, as healthcare professionals and policymakers, want to develop safe settings and environments and culture. This is an area, a domain that was not covered in the Lancet article, but we need to recognize that people are living also within their culture and their environment. And we want to help them create safe environments. Maybe that means we're working with families. Maybe that means we're talking in school settings. Maybe it means we're talking in community settings or doing other things, doing newspaper, that's old, sorry, doing doing some kind of media interview or whatever. For those of you who are younger, like it's this thing, you turn pages and you get ink on your hands. It was a long time ago. So we want to also help reduce and resolve conflicts that may occur in people's culture or their environments, and create and find systems of support within their environments. What can we do to shore up their systems? I've worked with a lot of school settings to try to make them more friendly to trans youth who are transitioning within the school setting. All right, so our competency domains within WPATH. We have knowledge, skills, and cultural awareness to try to cover all those areas in relation to the caregiver-care receiver relationship. We start with that because that is the most important thing that any of us is bringing. Then we need our content knowledge. We want it to be solid. You're going to get a whole bunch of content knowledge today and tomorrow if you don't have it. You're going to get very updated content knowledge, especially around the standards of care. We have to know a lot about interdisciplinary practice. To me, that's one of the most exciting things in this field, especially like when we do virtual panels or when I attend programs and get to meet people like Marshall. I learn every time I'm in a WPATH program. We also need to tend to our professional responsibilities. So here are some examples of caregiver-care receiver relationship concerns. So some of our knowledge needs to be understanding that gender identity is not the whole person. It's one very important component, but we have to listen to people. Like I've had young people who they want to finish out playing soccer, for example, on a girls' team at school, and that's more important to them than transitioning, but then they want to start their hormones and name change right at the end of soccer season so they can enter college as a guy. Okay, so we have to listen to what is the important piece of the identity that a person is experiencing. Or it may be there are other aspects, religious or cultural identities we need to be attuned to that make them feel like they need to wait, or we need to be attuned to helping them with. And recognize this is a field with a very evolving language. It has changed numerous times just in the past decade. And I think it's getting better and better. So I don't think it's just frivolous. It's gotten really a lot better, I think. We want to have the skills to create welcoming environments and to develop the rapport, whether we're medical or mental health care providers or other kind of healthcare professionals or legal consultants or policy professionals. We also need to have language that works across their settings and in their settings. And I may be talking one way with the young person and then adapt when the parents come in until I can bring them all together, okay, bring them along. And then we want to have a respectful rapport within the context of the culture they're in. And a really important thing is to understand there's a power imbalance. I wake up every morning and I'm just me, but I have to remember that people are coming to see Dr. Massey, and I have this website, and they think that I'm the person who's going to give them permission or whatever, or tell them, yes, you are trans. And they need help knowing, like feeling safe. And especially I find like some young people who, some of the younger gay boys come to me and they feel a little intimidated because I look like this straight cisgender assumed-ish dude. And so they aren't always comfortable. So we have to sometimes really make an effort. And then we also have some challenging history with the standards of care that, Chris Booth's going to talk a little bit about that the standards of care have not made healthcare as accessible as they are now. We have made tremendous progress in making healthcare accessible for trans folks now, affirming healthcare. So we want to recognize that people come in with a lot of different backgrounds and experiences, and they may have read old versions of the standards of care, by the way. So we want to get folks up to date. The foundation of all this relational stuff is dignity and respect. That means we always want to respect And remember that trans folks are not just our clients or patients, they're our providers, they're coworkers, they're community leaders, and they are family members, grandparents. I got step-grandkids. We have children, siblings, etc. So an important way to show respect is always follow their lead around their name and pronoun, and it doesn't matter what their history is or what they look like. If I come in your office and I tell you I am a woman, then I want you to refer to me as she, and perhaps ma'am if you live in the South. So, and also regardless of gender marker. So we always also want to speak about trans folks if they're in the room, because people sometimes say things. I've had people say things that were insulting to trans folks, not realizing I are one. And they may also have their loved ones in the room. So you never know who you're offending or hurting, whose life you're making more challenging, more scary. All right, so non-binary pronouns. Yeah, when I talk at schools, they love this. So drive English teachers crazy. What are the other points of non-binary pronouns? Parents are just too old. So demonstrate that difference. Confuse any of us north of 40. And then sometimes we get psychological elbow room with the non-binary pronouns. I've had some folks tell me, like, I wasn't ready for he, but I didn't feel like she, and they was a better step. So that's not everybody's story, but it's some people's story. It is also a way to create social change. All of these things, I think, can be true. And that's cool. And I say this because, again, being of a certain age, I remember reading the newspaper or textbooks, and they only use masculine pronouns, as if those are the only individuals who mattered on the planet. And so through repeated efforts and bringing that awareness, that is no longer the case, at least where I live, in the US of A. There's also been a change in racist language, where we used to only, again in the US of A, speak of people's races if they were not white. But now everybody has a race, and so either nobody's race is mentioned or everybody's race is mentioned, as it should be. So we are creating change by using different language. So in our core competencies, we also want to recognize when people are coming for care, it can be for a variety of things. They may be coming for trans issues or gender diversity, gender questioning issues, but it may be other reasons too. It may be couples therapy. It may be stress management at work. It may be a health condition that has nothing to do with being trans. So we want to be sensitive about that. Then it's also really important as healthcare providers to know ourselves. Because guess what? We grew up in the environments that were saturated with all that binary stuff I was talking about earlier. At least most of us did. And so it's important for us to think about our cultural values and biases and stereotypes. Again, recognizing our power and privilege, as most of us here are educated, had the finances to be able to get here, and the time to be able to get here. So we have a lot of privilege that some of our clients don't, some of our patients don't. And so we may have different ways of addressing that. There are a lot of times I will reduce my fee drastically for folks to make things more accessible. There is that power imbalance, again, because not only our education, but even with the standards of care changing, folks still are needing letters to access some care. And then being part of institutions that have harmed trans folks. So there are a lot of institutions that have had policies that are anti-trans, very anti-trans. Not to mention, a lot of them have had policies that are anti-gay. And a lot of these are improving, but there's still so much work to do. So TransPulse Canada was an important study done with nearly 3,000 participants. I think the first report I'll have is from 2019, but they did data collection online, and they used major cities here in Canada, and it was a follow-up of a study, Transpulse Ontario, done a few years before. And in this study, they really wanted to prioritize some populations: Indigenous folks, immigrants, sex workers, folks who identified as having a disability, youth and older folks, as well as racialized, rural, and non-binary individuals. And the eligibility was being 14 years of age or older and a resident of Canada. And they had English and French forms as well as short and long form. So this report was provided by Greta Bauer, and this was on non-binary folks. And again, it was an expansion of the 2010 Transpulse Ontario study. These results were presented at the 2020 virtual WPATH, and they had broken it down, and we can see that there are some important groups here. Some of these minority groups are identified. I think it's really significant to notice 30% identify as neurodivergent. If you're new to the field, that's a thing. It's really important. That's all I'm going to say at the moment. I think Chris may touch on that later. But it's really significant. And we also see a lot of folks with a low income. And there are a number of reasons for that. So we're going to talk a little about that later. So breakdown by groups. We had the biggest group, obviously, in the 25 to 34 year range. But we had something of a spread in the other age ranges. This is really important. So comparing the 2009 Transpulse Ontario to 2019 results, look at the number of people in 2009. 36% of the respondents had considered suicide, had suicidal thoughts. In 2019, it was a little better, 31%. Still really high. Attempted suicide, 10% in 2009, down to 6% in 2019. Still really high. These numbers are similar to numbers from the U.S. Trans Survey, which was published in 2016. It was done in 2015. Very similar. If you look within the last month, 39% of the respondents of the U.S. Trans Survey, which had about 28,000 respondents, 39% had significant or serious psychological distress in the last month, compared with 5% in the general population. 40% had attempted suicide at least once, compared to 4.5% in the general population. Nearly 10 times the population. So we're seeing similar numbers, and having done talks in other countries, I can tell you we see very similar phenomena. So in the Transpulse Canada study, what we see is that over half said they had fair or poor mental health. Only about 16% said they had excellent or very good mental health, and about a quarter said they had good mental health. So we're seeing there's a lot of minority stress. That's what's at work here for a lot of folks. Not everybody, but a lot. Minority stress, if you don't know the term, is unique to any minority group. Okay, this can apply to other minority groups as well. But in this realm, this training, we're talking about minority stress that is unique to trans and gender diverse folks, and cisgender folks don't have it because they're fitting in to the cultural expectations. They're not swimming upstream. And this is embedded in the cultural experience. Rooted in negative experiences of discrimination, stigma, and internalized stigma. Because people hear a negative thing said, it's really hard not to internalize that, or to at least know that that possibility is out there in the world. This stress can cause health-related concerns. I remember anticipating coming out to the woman who's my fiance back eons ago when we were just taking dance lessons together. And after doing so, I remember driving home, and my body just kept going. I just kept exhaling. And I realized this is minority stress. Like I had all this tension built up because I didn't know how it was going to go. It went okay, but I didn't know. It was this risk. And I could potentially lose this dance community that I really enjoy. You know, it was one of the few places where I was stealth. Most of my life I'm super out because I have a website and my colleagues know me and everything, but it was a new community for me, and so people didn't know at that point. Now a lot of people do. And this has risk and protective factors we're going to touch on. Microaggressions is how a lot of this happens. Chester Pierce was a psychiatrist at Harvard who noticed that some of the other students or his colleagues would treat the other students and people of color with behavioral and verbal indignities that communicated some hostility and negativity and devaluing of a person. They could be overt or covert. I'm going to give you an example in a minute. And they could be intentional or unintentional. And they aren't micro because they're small or insignificant. They're micro because, well, I'll explain that in a second, but the examples include invalidations, like negating thoughts or feelings or excluding people of a particular group. It can be insults that are just rude, insensitive, again, demeaning of somebody's identity, their heritage. It may be subtle or hidden or unknown to the target. I've had people, I have to say, now that I'm seen as a straight, white, assumed cisgender dude, people say things to me now, assuming that I have a certain set of beliefs and life experiences that I do not. And I have heard racist, sexist, homophobic, and transphobic things. And when it first happened, each time, I was stunned. I was like, I had heard people say stuff like this, but you're actually saying this to me. And I'm not a confrontational person who likes conflict to begin with, so it took me a minute to adjust and to learn, like, how do I want to address this and use my privilege in a way that is effective in addressing people's assumptions and racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia. So you may get to help your patients and clients do that, as well as finding your own ways of doing that. But there can also be micro-assaults, the derogation, verbal and nonverbal, name-calling, avoiding, and discrimination. So macro is when there's a systemic rule, a law, a policy that prohibits access to care, prohibits inclusion in events, access to bathrooms, etc. In the US, it used to be you can't serve in the military if you're trans. Microaggressions are on the individual level or small groups. So in the past 5 years, this is from TransPulse Canada. Look at this. People were verbally harassed. 68% of the respondents said they were. 40% plus sexually harassed. Over 30% physically intimidated or threatened. Over a fourth had been sexually assaulted. And 16% had actually experienced physical violence. Here's more minority stress comes out. In avoiding public spaces, if the world is a violent, scary place, what do? You're very selective about where you go. So a small number of people didn't avoid any places. 20% avoided 1 or 2 places. Almost 2/3 avoided 3 or more places because it doesn't feel safe. So intersectionality is a really important term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in '91, dealing with intersecting identities, Remember how I said you may have a soccer player who wants to keep playing soccer. Well, there can also be racial identities that intersect immigrant status. There are a number of identities, disabilities, that mean people are going to be further removed from access to power and privilege. And we cannot separate our gender identity from all of our other identities. They all affect how we're treated by society. And I urge you to know that the experience of me transitioning as a straight white guy, assumed, is very different than for my brothers and sisters of color. And so we have to talk about openly with them their experiences and the dangers and being stopped by police. And I cannot speak to that other than to say, please talk to some folks in your community, because I haven't had that experience. And so I cannot really honestly speak about that other than what I see on the news. So please talk to some folks who can help you navigate these waters. And we have to understand they're going to have very different experiences than somebody like I do. So we can't do ethical work if we aren't aware of these differences. And again, aware of the power and privilege that we hold, especially institutionalized, and understand that these power and privilege issues and the intersecting identities may make people scared or afraid as they're coming to interact with the healthcare industry. That's what we are. We're a healthcare industry. This is one of many important studies on trans and two-spirit and gender diverse communities. And this is a review by Jackson et al. And it highlights that we need to be working in these communities with individual interventions to connect the culture and identity of two-spirit folks, as well as look at the health programs and the health policies to try to develop decolonizing environments and promoting self-determination. If we look at these minority groups, talk about the intersecting identities, we've got folks who are rating their mental health even worse than we saw. We saw the overall mental health, the respondents, it was about 54% were rating they had poor or fair mental health. Those rates go higher when we're working with indigenous individuals. Not as bad with established immigrants or folks in some rural communities, but higher for folks who are racialized, higher for folks who are sex workers or young people, higher for folks living with disabilities or who are non-binary. Because people are much more comfortable when they can fit into a binary. The cisgender world is much more comfortable with folks who fit in binary expectations. So non-binary folks are at a high risk. Some of the ruder things that were said to me was when I was literally in transition and it was harder to tell if I was male or female. So it's a higher risk time. Look at how much fear people have about being stopped by police or harassed by security. 74% of the indigenous folks, 94% of the black but not indigenous. A lot less for the white folks, but I still would like not to ever be stopped by a police officer. Or people of color, 65%, who are not black or indigenous. So there's a lot of fear of authority figures. So if it's not clear, being trans or gender nonconforming, gender diverse, is not mental illness, but it causes a lot of stress. So here's where we come in with risk and protective factors. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. We've got those distal processes. We've talked about prejudice and discrimination and violence that people encounter. So those external processes that people then internalize. They become things they expect or fear, expecting rejection. So trans folks, gender diverse people learn to hide and they have that internalized stigma because of hiding. Coping and social support is where we can make a huge, huge difference. I'm going to give you a brief story. I was meeting some friends of my fiance, and they did not know that I was trans. She hadn't had a chance to talk to them about that yet. And as we're there, they used the term he, she about somebody that was one of their coworkers. So I'm there and trying to figure out, what do I do? So I sat with it and said, we'll talk about it with them the next morning. My fiance was very distressed for me. And the next morning I said, hey, I want to have a conversation with y'all about what you were saying about that young person you work with. So I was uncomfortable with that term because I work with a lot of trans youth. In fact, I started working with trans folks so much as a specialty because they started coming to me after my own gender transition. I'm transgender. Really? Yeah. But what I loved was, this was a straight couple, and the wife said, well, I have some questions for you. And so I talked to her about SOC in 7. I talked to her about, well, like, how do you know that young? I said, well, when did you know you were a girl? True. So she, had this conversation with me and understood on the other side. And what I got to see by having this conversation with her was that she was actually concerned for this young person. So many people don't understand, especially with youth. And so we need to engage in conversation, be willing to go there with them. I did say to her, as she said, well, I'm so glad you told me. She said, I just have never been around any trans people. And I said, well, that you know of. Oh. And I said to her, but that term he, she, that's just not okay. You can't use that term. So we can lovingly talk with people and educate them. That's where we can provide coping and social support for our patients directly or for their loved ones. And we can teach those skills to folks we work with. So we're going to get a lot of content knowledge here today. And I'm going to say right now, since we got a little bit of a late start, I might go just a couple minutes over. I hope you all bear with me. I'm going to try to wrap it up here in a few minutes, though. But we need to have a lot of knowledge about gender health care, but also about general health care for trans folks. Like, trans folks still need to, if you have a prostate, you still need prostate exams. If you have a uterus, you still need to have a pap smear, particularly if you have penetrative sex. So there are things we still need to know and think about in supporting health care for folks. And we need to look at issues over the lifespan, from young kids. My youngest families I've consulted with, kids 2-3 years old, to folks in their 60s and 70s. We want to incorporate the scientific evidence with our therapeutic rapport with the folks we're working with to help in partner decision making. And then again, recognizing the power imbalance and try to help equalize that while informing people so they're making informed decisions. We need to have competency working with and diagnosing all sorts of conditions in addition to gender dysphoria. So we have to be grounded in our general skills as well as gender-specific skills. And then in regions and countries where it's used, we use the ICD or whatever the classification system is that may be needed for accessing healthcare. And we also have to know about specific content areas that if we're going to see folks in certain specialty areas, whether it's around sexual and reproductive health, surgery, hormones, voice and communication, or intersex or unique individuals. So again, folks may be coming to mental health professionals for a variety of reasons, and we can be trained in mental health in all sorts of fields, from nursing to family practice to psychiatry, psychology, mental health counseling, social work, marriage and family therapy. We all need to have our grounding in our specific field as well as WPATH-related care. And we have to be licensed and have a postgraduate degree and want to bring theoretical evidence-based training, if we're working with youth in particular, of child, adolescent, and family mental health across the spectrum. And we're going to have folks talking about that later today in depth, and have training in gender identity and diversity, again, across the lifespan. And we want to help people have informed care, and so we have to be able to assess their ability to consent or assent to the care that they are pursuing or that we're referring them for. So we want to have knowledge of puberty blocking information, and you're going to get some of that, as well as especially training in autism spectrum disorders and other neurodiversity because of the high co-occurrence. As well as we're going to continue our professional development because there's so much happening in the field now. So you want to keep coming to programs, WPATH or local or US PATH next year in Denver. EPATH is going to be in the spring in Ireland. So we also, in our education chapter, are advocating to educate all personnel, government, NGO, private professionals, to receive cultural awareness and training. I was talking with somebody last night who's working with an organization doing the training at the organization where she works. And we want to teach them about these principles of dignity and respect, as well as have all healthcare personnel receive cultural awareness and sensitivity training in their initial orientation and in renewing annual orientation and education, as well as having the institutions providing learning objectives to help folks progress in their trans healthcare and their teaching around trans healthcare. So interdisciplinary practice, as I mentioned, that's so exciting. You heard there's a range of folks you're going to be hearing from today. I hope wherever you're practicing, you will develop a network of interdisciplinary professionals you work with, because that makes this field so rich, and we do need each other. Surgeons, hormone prescribers, voice and communication therapists, we all need each other and need to consult with each other. Legal folks, systems we're working with, we all need to work together. So I talked about the minority stress issues and a little bit about health. Here's another way it affects folks. So remember talking about avoiding things, avoiding public places? Trans and gender diverse folks, this is from the US Trans Survey, almost 60% avoid public restrooms. How do they do that? Almost a third limit their food and drink. Think about that. I don't know about you. I don't function that well if I'm not hydrated or eating well. And parents are astonished when I work with their kids because they don't know their kids are not drinking and eating to avoid the school bathrooms. So we have to do problem solving around these things and realize the stress this is putting on the folks we're working with. And there are even healthcare complications further, because almost 10% of these folks said they ended up with some type of medical complication like a urinary tract infection, kidney infection, or some other complication. A mother said she had to take her child to the ER, the emergency room, because of impacted bowels. Impacted bowels can lead to a burst colon that can kill somebody if somebody goes septic. So these are not trivial. These are serious things we have to think about and talk about. You're going to see folks who are in various stages of transition. Again, that's why you want to be able to communicate with a lot of different professionals. Some have not sure, they're questioning, some have started, some are planning, some are in process, some have completed their medical stuff. So as professionals, this is our last domain, we have to have knowledge, especially of things about the importance of confidentiality. Sometimes, especially working with youth, they're not ready for their parents to know yet. Okay, and we have to work on that with them. Understanding the ethical standards of care for trans folks and identifying gaps in our own personal knowledge as well as in the field. Like I can speak about, we know this, I can say we do not know that. Or I have to find out about that for you. I think there's information, but let me get it for you. We want to have the skills to negotiate multiple roles because I have both had to be the therapist and then go talk to the school and be an advocate or do a talk to the whole community of a school. So I'm in multiple hats that we get to navigate if we are advocating and helping and supporting our trans and gender diverse folks who we're working with. And we want to listen to and affirm the experiences of trans and gender diverse folks and promote deeper understanding in the field. And we have to have cultural awareness about the balance of non-maleficence and beneficence, like the doing no harm versus helping. So we want to be advocates. So we've talked a lot about the confidentiality, the ethical standards, staying up to date. I would encourage you in your practices to have universal approaches to correct pronouns. So training your staff so they're aware and have good interaction skills, maybe even have role plays with them. Have documentation strategies, as well as being aware of the family dynamics that are at play, working with the youth. And then please look at the bathroom signage, other signage, look at your forms if you have forms, or your website forms, your EHRs. If you're a medical provider, think about your physical exam sensitivities, signage, and staff member education, and always safety. So I want to close by saying there used to be a single narrative. People used to think they had to have a trans story that was the same. Transitioning male to female, female to male. They're attracted to the opposite sex, fitting that trying to fit into that ladder of assumptions. But guess what? It's not true. And you're going to see that the more folks you see. So it used to be reinforced, but we want to let folks have a broader narrative and a broader understanding that it doesn't fit everybody, trapped in the wrong body. This body did a lot of great things in my lifetime. There are just some parts that had to get aligned. Not everybody's going to want to medically transition, and not everybody wants to move one binary gender to the other. As healthcare professionals, we can change the conversations where we work in the communities and with the folks we work with. That said, I thank you for being here, and I hope you have a great conference.